Okay. All right. Good evening and welcome. The time is now 5:01 p.m. and I would like to call the August 24th, 2023 meeting of the Energy Facility Siting Council to order. Mr. Secretary, please call the roll.
Marcy Grail,
Here.
Kent Howe,
Here.
Jordan Truitt,
Here.
Cindy Condon,
Here.
Perry Chalktooth, Ann Byer,
Here.
Richard Devlin.
Here.
Madam Chair, you have a quorum.
Thank you. Mr. Secretary, are there any agenda modifications?
Madam Chair, there is one agenda modification. Unfortunately, we're not able to get the July meeting minutes done in time. They're close to being drafted. We should have those out soon, just not quite ready. They were quite complicated from last time, so those aren't ready. So in terms of the first agenda item, there will be no need to take action on those.
Thank you. I have the following announcements. For tonight's public hearing on Obsidian Solar Center Amendment Number 1 and Agenda Item C, Public Comment Period, there are 3 ways to let us know you are in.
This is Cindy. Can anybody hear me?
I can hear you, Cindy.
So I have
I
lost.
can't hear anything else.
Yeah, I've lost sound. Did you all lose sound too? I'm gonna text Todd since I don't see a way to chat.
Meeting.
No.
Energy Facility Siting Council meetings shall be conducted in a respectful and courteous manner where everyone is allowed to state their positions at the appropriate time.
I think she went mute again. Jordan or Cindy, can you hear him?
Cannot, Perry. I can hear you.
Okay, how about now? Can you hear us now?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
All right. So we are going to move forward as previously stated. We will not be taking action on the July minutes at this time. So our next item on the agenda is the council secretary report. Mr. Secretary.
Thank you, Madam Chair. First, I have council updates. So I had recently heard from the governor's office that they are not moving forward with the replacement for Councilmember Truitt's position. So Councilmember Truitt's term ends September 22nd, next month. So they are now, the governor's office is now looking at the November legislative days instead of the September legislative days. So as we've had this conversation, this question come up numerous times, even if a council member's term ends, they're technically still on the council until they resign or until they're replaced. So I reached out to Councilmember Truitt, and he's graciously agreed to stay on until he is replaced. We very much appreciate that. And so certainly we'll be working with the governor's office to try to find a replacement for November. Next, I have project updates. The first is the Muddy Creek Energy Project. This is a proposed 199 megawatt solar project and battery storage approximately 8 miles south of Brownsville and immediately east of Interstate 5. We received the notice of intent on May 19th of this year. On July 25th of this year, we held a public information meeting in Brownsville. We had approximately 100 people attend in person, including Councilmember Condon in person and Councilmember Byer remotely. The comment period closed on August 11th, and in total, we received 142 comments. So 80 of those comments were submitted through our comment portal. So I want to, kind of provide some kudos to Wally and our IT department. So this is something that we've worked on in the last couple of years to provide another alternative method for people to provide public comment, and we're increasingly seeing the use of that. And one of the values is there's an opportunity to tie comments directly to council standards. So while not everybody did that, and at the public information or the notice of intent stage, it's a little more nebulous. But that being said, as we did get, quite a few people attempting to connect their comments to standards, which is great. And I think that will help as we move forward. So I think that's a pretty big outreach in terms of the number of comments. None of those were what I call robo comments. These were all individual people submitting individual comments. So that's a pretty big number. And obviously with the conversion of farmland in the Willamette Valley, of high value farmland, there's a lot of interest on this project. Any questions before I move on to the next one? Or any impressions by Councilmember Condon or Councilmember Byer who were in attendance?
Byer?
This is Ann Byer, and I did listen in to most of the presentation. I want to give staff kudos, particularly for that, trying to keep the focus on the standards, because I think that really helped to educate all the people who were there. It sounded like a very packed house, and that's a good thing. But I think it helped focus the discussion. It was a robust discussion. I learned a lot from the people who made comments at this really early stage. So as Council Secretary Cornett observed, we'll have a lot of comments on this and a lot to sort through. So thanks to staff.
Thank you.
And this is Cindy. And just I'll echo what Ann said. I'm getting some feedback.
You're fine on our end,
Okay.
just in case.
Okay, thanks. And one of the things I was struck by is that the people present seemed to be frustrated that they hadn't heard about the project beforehand, and I don't know how that gets remedied. But I think applicants could work harder on that. It's just an impression I got.
For that comment.
Okay, moving on to the Summit Ridge Wind Farm. So on August 17th, we received amendment number 6 for the Summit Ridge Wind Farm. This is an approved 194 megawatt wind farm located in Wasco County, approximately 17 miles southeast of The Dalles. The project was originally approved in August 2011. Amendment number 6 proposes to reduce the total number of wind turbines from 72 to 32, but increase the size of the 32 wind turbines, add up to 47 megawatts of solar PV energy generation and associated related in this supporting facilities, which will include amending the site boundary to be able to have that equipment, and then request the construction completion deadline be amended from August 19th of 2023 to August 19th of 2026. So they have begun construction. There's some, enough to justify that they've begun construction, but the major components of the facility have not. Next on my list is the Sunstone Solar Project. During my last council secretary report in July, I indicated that we were close to receiving a preliminary application for that project. We've now received it. As I'd indicated during that meeting, the project, when it came in under the notice of intent, was called the Echo Solar Project. They renamed it to the Sunstone. So this is in Morrow County, approximately 15 miles northeast of Lexington, and really beginning at the southeast corner of the Boardman Bombing Range. It's proposed as a 10,900 acre or 17 square mile solar facility. Next, I have related to wildlife monitoring updates. So all site certificates for wind energy generation facilities include a requirement to implement a wildlife monitoring and mitigation plan, where the plan includes short and long-term monitoring and potentially mitigation measures. That's what's included in each of those plans. For 5 of the facilities that have been approved by the council, these wildlife monitoring mitigation plans include a requirement that applies to the department, and that the department must make the results of annual monitoring available for public comment. These facilities include State Line Wind Project, Bigelow Canyon Wind Farm, Leaning Juniper 2A, Leaning Juniper 2B, and the Klondike 3 Wind Project. To support making the results available, the department prepares a staff memo to council that was provided to council as part of your packet materials. This summarizes the results of the prior year's monitoring for each of these facilities. And this information was also posted to each of the project web pages with a 60-day comment time frame. So long-term monitoring of these facilities includes 5-year monitoring for raptor nest use and 3-year monitoring for Washington ground squirrel activity and annual incidental wildlife monitoring and reporting. So the information was provided to council. It was posted on the project pages and is currently open for public comment in case anybody is interested in commenting. Next, I have an update on rulemaking. So the council recently gave us direction to move forward on the contested case rulemaking. So Tom Jackman has initiated that. So first rulemaking advisory committee meeting for that rulemaking will be on September 7th from 9 to 11. That will include introducing what the rulemaking project is and going over ideas with rulemaking advisory committee members about any issues or areas of concern that they're interested in focusing on during the rulemaking. If there are any council members who would be interested in attending, I think it'll likely be remote. You could certainly come in, but likely call in or join the webinar. If you are interested, please reach out to either me or Tom, and we can get you that information about how to join on September 7th from 9 to 11. I've got two compliance updates. The first is related to the Shepherd's Flat South facility. This is a wind energy facility located in Gillum and Morrow counties. The facility consists of 116 turbines with a peak generating capacity of 290 megawatts. The facility commenced operation in September of 2012. On August 15th of this year, the department was notified of a ferruginous hawk fatality caused by a suspected turbine collision. So presumably they found, the dead raptor at the base of the turbine. So the certificate holder documented the fatality with its wildlife incident report. So they provided information to us timely. Next is the Montag Solar Facility. That also has a name change. I'm somewhat disinclined to try to state the name because I don't think I will pronounce it correctly, and I will get there in the future. But for now, we'll just say what is formerly known as the Montague Solar Facility. So it is recently operating. It commenced operation on April 25th of this year. It's 162 megawatts, and it's in Gillum County. On August 15th of this year, the department was notified that electrical connectors associated with the project caused a 2.5 acre brush fire. So something failed with the electrical equipment and sparked a wildfire or a brush fire. It was limited to 2.5 acres. Immediately upon discovery, site personnel began putting out the fire. There were no injuries associated with the event. The incident did not affect the operating status of the facility, and the certificate holder provided notification to the department within the required time frame. So it's still fairly new, so we don't have any follow-up yet at this point in time. I have an other category, which I'm going to get into right now. And this really goes back, part of it relates to last council meeting, part of it relates to this council meeting. So when we have a draft proposed order and there's a council's review of a draft proposed order, that can happen either at an application or during an amendment or a type A amendment. So during the last council meeting, questions were raised by some council members, and I think the public, about the council's ability to fully evaluate and understand comments raised on the record of the draft proposed order, because some of those comments were being raised, right up close to the comment deadline. So before I kind of go explain what we're going to do moving forward, I'm going to go back in time. Previously, currently in the rules and the statutes, there's no legal requirement for the public hearing tonight, or during an application for the council to be present at the draft proposed order hearing. That is not a legal requirement. Historically, it was the council appointed hearing officer on applications that would do it. They would set the meeting up, have it in proximity. That is a requirement, to be in proximity of the facility and in person. Those are requirements, but it doesn't have to be in front of council. When we started to see a lot of interest in wind facilities, people began effectively testifying during the regular public comment timeframe to the council, which was very, it lacked context. And so what we recognized was there is a lot of value in having public hearings in front of the decision makers. So while it's not required, we made that change quite some time ago, and we've largely kept to it. And I think that's a good change. And, unless council's not interested in doing that, our intent is to keep doing that, which is exactly why we're here tonight. We've also, the council has the responsibility of reviewing the draft proposed order as well. So previously, a hearing officer would run it. Then at a regular council meeting, the council would receive the comments and, get a presentation by staff or the hearing officer and review the draft proposed order. Well, once we changed the system to allow or to have the public hearings in front of council, we also thought, well, for those projects that don't have much in the way of comments or interest, let's have the hearing Thursday night. We want to do it in the evening so people have an opportunity after work to come and testify, so it doesn't impact them. But then the next day, if there are limited or no public comments, there's no reason why the council can't do the review of the DPO. So we put that in there as an option. It's always been an option. It's never been a mandate. But I think by putting it on the Friday, people feel compelled. I think applicants have a sense that this is a requirement, that it should be done if it's on there. I think some staff feel like that. I think council members, I think people feel like there's pressure to do it on the Friday after, just because it's on the agenda, even though it's never has been intended to be a mandate. So based upon last council meeting, we decided to make a change. And that change is what we're going to be seeing tonight. And so we'll have a chance to take a look at this and see if this works. The idea then is we would have the regular public hearing. Presumably the record will close tonight. Rather than having the council's review review of the DPO tomorrow, we will put it on the next council agenda, which will be September. So any comments that come in tonight, you'll have more time to think about, to review, before you make your review and provide your comments to us on the draft proposed order. But one of the things that we can gain value out of this is that we can actually come back in September with a draft of the proposed order, not the draft proposed order, but a draft of the proposed order. So whatever comments we receive tonight from the certificate holder, from the public, from council, while the record is still open, between now and the next council meeting, we can actually take that information, create our draft of the proposed order, meaning, anything that we need to respond to in terms of findings of fact, conclusions of law, conditions of approval. We can have our draft of that and provide that to you at the next council meeting. So not only will you have more time to review the comments, you will get a chance to see how we are looking to respond to those comments. And then after the next council meeting, it should only be, it should be very quick for us to turn around the proposed order and issue the notice associated with that. So by changing this, we're likely not to actually lose much time. And it should be able to gain more value in having more time for the council review and seeing where staff is intending to go with those findings. So this is sort of a new model. We'll get a chance to take a look at it and revisit this in September and see if you like this better. The other thing that we heard during the last meeting was that there was some stated confusion about what could be commented on during the draft proposed order. And so we intend in the future, whether it's an application or amendment, to have a fairly general statement. We don't want to list everything that's possibly could be commented on, but instead we will put in, a pretty general statement to say that anything within the draft proposed order, anything in with the request for amendment or, the request for site certificate is eligible to be commented on. So we will do those two things. And then lastly on my list is the next council meeting is dates are September 21st and 22nd. So I can confirm that we do need a council meeting in September. We will not need 2 days. We will need 1 day. Likely it will be in Salem, but we have not put together a draft agenda and have not provided that to Chair Grail yet for her review and verification of that. So that should happen pretty soon. That's what we believe will happen. But again, we need to get a little more detail together first and then see if Chair Grail is in agreement with that. So with that, I will conclude my secretary report.
Excuse me. Thank you, Secretary Cornett. Any questions, comments from council? I see heads nodding no, so we will move forward. The next item on our agenda is agenda item B, which is the application phase 1 rulemaking. This is an action item, and we have Thomas Jackman, Rules Coordinator, to present. Tom?
Thank you, Madam Chair, council members. My name is Thomas Jackman, and I am your Rules Coordinator. Today, we will be discussing Council's application process review phase 1 rulemaking, and I will be giving you a brief history of this rulemaking and then discussing the proposed final language along with some comments that we received at the close of the public comment period. Next slide. So the next slide. Sorry. The rulemaking process really has 5 steps. Began with initiation of rulemaking on this rulemaking earlier this year. Kind of unique to this rulemaking is we kind of had an idea of what we wanted to do. So we already had developed a set of draft proposed rules at that time. We met with the RAC. We discussed those rules, the draft proposal. We received some comment. Upon receiving feedback from that and discussing it with council, we issued the notice of proposed rulemaking in June. That began a formal public comment period, which lasted for 49 days. And then, which terminated just recently on the 18th. And we are now at the end of that public comment period, going to go over those last couple of comments we received and going to be considering adoption of permanent rules. Next slide. So just as a reminder, the scope of this rulemaking was to take a look at language found in divisions 15 through 26, which ultimately resulted in us making some changes in divisions 15 through 22. And we wanted to ensure that the rules were more consistent, that they flowed more logically, that somebody who was new to the process, who wanted to participate and kind of understand how the process worked, could, utilize the rule structure and the rule headings to kind of get a sense for how the application process for a site certificate goes. And we, had made a determination in deciding to do this rulemaking that, some of the rules were kind of vague or confusing in the way that they were structured, and that an update could improve that. The goal was not to change the standards themselves, and so we did not make any changes that would result in raising or lowering the bar for an applicant actually seeking to go through the process of obtaining a site certificate. Next slide. So again, there was 5 divisions that were altered in some way: Division 1, 15, 20, 21, and 22, with most of the changes taking place in Division 15. These changes were summarized in attachment 3 of the council packet that you received and can be divided into roughly 3 categories. So the largest by far and the bulk of the changes was a consolidating of references to the department responsibilities in the application process into Division 15. So as you'll see, essentially where it says the department must, which was kind of sprinkled throughout multiple divisions and is now largely consolidated into Division 15. So, it should help people understand a little bit better about what an applicant must do versus what the department must do in trying to make a determination about whether they, agree or even just to follow along with the process. So next slide. So let's go through that. As just kind of a first example here, we had the department must issue public notice of any amendment, which was originally found in OAR 34520. It's now a subsection of OAR 34515. Next slide. So another example of this type of change is language that was pulled from Division 21, Rule 50, which pertains to the distribution by the department of a preliminary application and accompanying memorandum. And we combine that language with language found at 345 Division 15, 180, which pertains to the content of the agency memorandum. So it didn't make a whole lot of sense to have the distribution and content be in 2 different places. And now in the current proposed rules, they are in one place. So you can just go to that one rule or that one division and learn everything you need to know about this particular item without having to go to different places. Next slide. So the second change was to improve internal consistency of the rules and how they're structured in Division 15. So as you know, the citing process consists of several stages, including the notice of intent, the project order, the preliminary application, and so on. Next slide. The current version of the rules goes through these stages, but it treats each stage slightly differently in how the rules are actually structured. So at the notice of intent stage, the rules are kind of organized one way. At the project order stage, the rules covering that portion of the process organized in another way, and so on. So we took a look at each of those structures and we tried to, as best we can, they don't have perfect symmetry between them, but we tried to create a similar structure so that to the extent that the process has parallels, people don't get confused about what is in each of those segments. So next slide. So here you go. Here's kind of just kind of a pictorial or a visual example of kind of what we tried to match the subset of rules for each of the phase to the extent it made sense to do so. Next slide. So the biggest area where this happened was with public notice throughout the process. So currently there is a rule in the existing rule set at 345-15-110, which details with the process for public notice of a notice of intent. While the rules also require a public notice for a preliminary application and a complete application, we didn't have corresponding rules, at least not in the same structure. They were buried within other rules. And so if you're reading through the headings, you see there is a heading for public notice of a notice of intent, but then you keep scanning it, the words public notice don't appear as a heading like it does here. And you might read through that and think, oh, there's only public notice at this one stage. So we tried to kind of eliminate the possibility for that confusion. So next slide. So here you can see here, we now have two new rules, 171 and 194, which there's no new language here. We just took the language that was part of other rules and made them their own rules in the same way that we had a separate rule for public notice at the notice of intent stage. So now when you're glancing through the rules, you can see, oh, public notice here, public notice here, public notice here, and you'll be able to quickly identify if you had a question about notice for, you could easily identify where you need to go to find that. Next slide. So a second example of this change about internal consistency is we tried to modify, and there isn't a whole lot of this, but where we saw kind of parallel language in the rules, we modified, we tweaked the language so that it matched, and we didn't essentially have two different versions of rule language that was describing the same behavior. Because I don't know how familiar you are with rules of statutory or legal interpretation, but usually if you're using different language in different places within the same kind of framework, it's because you mean different things. So if you don't mean different things, it makes more sense to use the same language, because we do intend these rules to match here. So in this place, we added the word time and we removed the word agenda. So it was clear for each of these informational meetings, the same sort of structure was intended. They're not different types of informational meetings. They're different stages, but they're essentially the same in terms of how we approach them. Okay. So I'm kind of burning through this because you've heard me go through this before. So please stop me if you have any questions about these rule changes. Do we have any so far?
I'm looking at our friends on the screen. The council members are shaking their head no that are visible.
Okay, I just want to make sure I don't leave anybody behind here. But this is, I think, now the third or fourth time I've kind of gone over this, so I didn't want to belabor or bore you here. So another change we made, it's pretty minor, but we just kind of tried to polish up the rules by making them small edits to readability and clarity. And again, it bears repeating that the intent of those edits was not to alter the rules. This rulemaking was not about changing the process, just the rules that describe the process. So, and obviously, as part of moving rules around, we had to update references. So some of the rules in Division 20 and 21 that we moved to 15 referred to their kind of counterpart in 15. Well, now they're sitting in line with their counterpart. They didn't need to kind of cross-reference anymore, which allowed us to kind of get rid of those cross-references and I think it makes the rules a little cleaner and a little easier to follow. You don't have to jump around, and that it cleans up the language as well. Next slide. So I'm not going to go into too much about this because we discussed it, or rather my good friend and coworker, Chris, discussed this at the June FSIC meeting about the RAC feedback that we received, which was relatively narrow in scope. We received 3 responses to requests for feedback. So I'm not going to go over it again, but we did receive some feedback from the RAC, and we did incorporate that to where possible in updating the rules. Next slide. So after we did the notice of proposed rulemaking, that started the public comment period, and also we had a public hearing scheduled. The hearing was held in July, and we did have one person attend, but once I opened it up for public comment, they departed. So I guess they were there to see if anybody else had any comments, but had no comments themselves. But it was good to see one person, so I knew that it actually was working. Because if nobody showed up, then I would have been left wondering did it actually work. But yes, the link did work and we did have one person attend, but left no comments. We received, actually, ended up receiving 4 written comments. It says 2 here. We only received 2 substantive comments, one set from PGE and one from Friends of the Gorge, and also one from staff. And then there was one other comment that was just essentially, great job. We support what you guys are doing. So there was no substantive comments. So let's go over the 2 sets of comments we received from PGE and from Friends of the Gorge. So next slide. Okay. Yep, you're fine. Okay, so PGE had 2 comments, and their first comment was essentially a request to eliminate paper copies and also allow for the department to have more control and decision over the number of printed copies necessary. This is sort of outside the scope because it would kind of change the responsibilities of the participants in the process, but also not something we really are at liberty to do right now because there is existing statute at ORS 469-370, which essentially requires the department to inform the public that copies of the application are available at any time for inspection. So we need to have copies available for inspection. And we have, identified wherever possible, reducing waste and making this as efficient as possible and doing the absolute minimum number of printing that we can do. But in terms of eliminating the number of copies, I think it is our belief that this is going to have to wait for an update to the statute. So maybe that will come down at some point, but not yet. So staff is recommending no changes with regard to that request. As far as their second comment, PGE was requesting additional language be added to clarify the intent behind new notice requirements that were actually approved back in a prior rulemaking, but we waited to actually make the change for this go round because it was kind of as part of all these other changes we're making in Division 15. We added a new notice requirement throughout the process to provide notice to land management agencies and organizations with jurisdiction over protected areas identified in whatever that section of the notice period would be. Their comments they appear to be conflating the public notice requirements with the reviewing agency requirements, which are 2 separate things. The rules as written now do not limit who receives notice. They wanted to make it more clear about whether the federal agencies would be part of this, but staff feels like it's pretty clear as it's written that any entity who has jurisdiction or management over protected areas should be receiving notice, and that the language is pretty clear as written. But that, we should make it clear now on the public record that that is what is intended by these additions. But there's no need to kind of add language because the language itself does not limit who is in those categories. It's left wide open on purpose because we don't want to be prescriptive because it just applies to anybody who has control over those areas. So we don't want to, confuse people by adding additional language. Okay, so
Grail, Tom?
yes,
Tom,
yeah.
Chair Grail.
Councilmember Condon.
Thank you. Hey, Tom, I had a question, just with respect to comment number 2 and 1. I do want to compliment you on the way that you have prepared the packet for us. It was with enough detail for those who don't go through rulemaking very often to really understand what you're trying to do and made it really clear what each element was. So thank you for that. But in looking at this comment number 2 specifically, and going back to the section of who receives notice, so 34510152220 and 2B, where this change is going to take place. I'm just mentioning this so I don't forget it. because we're trying to get more clarity or give more clarity. A, B, and C, and now, or A, C, and D are pretty clear, very specific about who receives the notice. But I was left with the question of who are the people on the special mailing list? And because that remains undefined, and just as we go through this process of clarifying, if we could just look at that, to give more clarity on who are these special people,
So
or
we
who are, I
maintain,
should say, special people who are on the special mailing list.
I'd have to go back and look at that again because I haven't really thought about that, but yeah, Todd, why don't you speak on that one?
For the record, Todd Cornett. So there's a couple mailing lists that we have. We have a general mailing list. We have a special mailing list. Those are referred to in, I don't know if they're in statute, but certainly in rule. I think the general mailing list is pretty well defined. The special mailing list is not, has a specific definition for it. But what it is essentially when we get a new project and somebody shows up to say a public information meeting on a notice of intent, and they're not an adjacent landowner. So all the adjacent landowners within a certain distance are automatically going to receive paper notices because the rules and the statutes define who within the distance, from the project, based upon the assessor's tax rolls will get noticed. That's pretty clear. But anybody outside of that won't get notice unless they specifically ask for it. And so prior to email, that was a very physical note mailing list. People would say for project X, I want to receive all future notices. And we would maintain these lists for each project. And then later on, if we got a amendment, that list would still be there. Now that we've moved over to email, there still are some paper lists associated with some projects, but the vast majority have moved to our email systems where people just self-manage it. So the special mailing list, I think it's still an important thing. It's never been, I think, defined. And so I think absolutely, unless you just know what it is, there's probably some confusion about it. But that's really the history on it and where we're at. And so we still want to maintain those. But right now, again, it's mostly moving forward. People, managing, going on, signing up to receive all future notices by email of projects. But again, we do have historic paper mailing lists because some of our projects go back 30 to 40 years. So I don't know if that helps, but it probably doesn't answer your question, but at least helps define what the special mailing list is.
Yes, it's quite helpful, and it just in the wording of it, if it were more clear with respect to how do you get on that? Is it it might be just worded wrong. It says persons on any special mailing list set up for the proposed project. What's really special mailing list made up of people who have requested information. So I don't know how it's done. I just don't want to lose sight of it.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you.
Okay. Thank you for that comment. Any other questions or comments about PGE comments?
None here in the room.
Okay. So let's move to Friends of the Gorge. Next slide. So this first comment here relates to a request by Friends of the Gorge to extend the comment deadline due to a website error that listed the end of the public comment period incorrectly. So attorney for Friends, Nathan Baker, noticed the error and sent an email on August 9th and wrote then, he said, as a result of the error, this for the past 5 weeks that this posting has been on the FSEC webpage, anyone viewing it would have been misled into believing that it was too late to submit written comments. This may very well have frustrated and even precluded public participation in the rulemaking process under the circumstances, and in order to allow for meaningful public participation in written comments, Friends of the Columbia Gorge request the establishment and public announcement of a new deadline for written comments on this rulemaking. So I just wanted to briefly go over the actual requirements for notice and also the law that's surrounds the request for extension. So next slide. So as part of the notice requirements for rulemaking, they're laid out in statute, and we repeat them here in Rule 345, 1, sub 1. It is literally the first rule in 345 is notice of, is how you do the notice. So in that rule, it lists out that we are required to give notice to the Secretary of State. We're required to give notice to the people that have signed up for it by mail or email, using the same sort of, self-management that Secretary Cornett was talking about earlier. And also by sending a copy of by notice to legislators, which also gives a copy to, well, as part of the Secretary of State bulletin, that ends up in the Associated Press Capitol Press Room automatically. So those 4 categories are the ones that are statutorily and required by the rules. For each of those, I went back and double checked because I immediately was like, wait, the website was wrong. Let me make sure that everything else was correct. So fortunately, the notice dates for all those were correct. It was just an error on the website. And also, fortunately, the website had the correct date for the public hearing. So anybody who wanted to make comments could have attended that public hearing. It was dated correctly. It was just the end of the written public comment period, which we did correct immediately 9 days prior to the end of the actual end of the public period, which was August 18th. So let's go to the next slide. So I have here, just so there's no confusion, here is the exact rule that covers an extension for a request in a public comment period found at ORS 183, 335 sub 4, which states, upon request of an interested person received before the earliest date that the rule could become effective, after the giving of notice pursuant to subsection 1 of this section, the agency shall postpone the date of its intended action no less than 21, nor more than 90 days in order to allow the requesting person an opportunity to submit data, views, or arguments concerning the proposed action. So the issue here is a question of whether Friends can ask for an extension on behalf of the public when the law here explicitly states that the request must be made on the requester's own behalf. It says, as it says here, in order to allow the requesting person to submit data, views, or arguments, not so that someone else might be able to. Staff is concerned that it's kind of bad, precedent to allow for extension requests to be granted simply on the belief that someone might provide comments if an extension is granted. And if Friends wanted more time so that they could provide additional comments, they could have requested that, and we would have been legally required to give that extension to them, but they chose not to. And so, in view of that, the facts and the requirements, staff is recommending that we proceed. However, if council believes there is value in extending the public comment deadline, it is of course up to you, and you have the capability to extend that deadline by 21 to 90 days if you so choose.
Well, this is Chair Grail. I will ask council members if anyone has any comments on what Tom has said at this time.
I'll comment. This is Kent.
Yes, please.
It's like, I feel that generally I'm very supportive of having the public given them adequate opportunity. We bend over backwards here to make sure we get people able to comment on actions that come before us. But this notice was open for comment for 49 days, and no one requested an extension before the deadline. All the legal obligations have been met, and so I don't really see any value in extending the public comment deadline.
Chair Howell, Councilmember Condon, were you raising your hand?
I wasn't raising my hand, but I
Okay.
will say that I agree fully with what Councilmember House has just stated.
Thank you. I just see Councilmember Truitt. He's given a thumbs up. Councilmember Byer, Councilmember Devlin, Councilmember Choctaw. So on behalf of the council, thank you for summarizing that. I would absolutely concur that we have all been very mindful of the public and ensuring that people have time. And while I appreciate friends looking out without having someone specifically ask, I think we are inclined to support staff's recommendation, so we do not wish to extend.
Okay. Any other thoughts or comments on that? Otherwise, I will ask, go to the next slide. So Friends' second comment was to modify 345-15-180 sub 1 to change, it's currently states, or the current proposed language is until the department determines the application to be complete, as described in some other rules, it is a preliminary, it's deemed a preliminary application. They want to add unless and until, and staff does not recommend adding the proposed language because their concern is, as laid out in their comment, is that somebody might think that if it just says until, that a reader might be confused that all applications eventually would be deemed complete. So adding unless clarifies that won't necessarily happen. Yet, just don't like adding language where the rules are relatively clear. It is abundantly clear throughout the rules because it specifically states this, that an application doesn't necessarily hit completion stage. Just a few lines down at 194, it states, if 190 sub 4 rather, if the applicant does not submit information by the deadline specified by the department, including any allowed extension, the council may reject the application. So staff does not believe that there is any confusion sufficient to need to add additional language to this rule to clarify that applications aren't always going to hit the completion stage. Any thoughts or comments about that one? Okay.
We are saying no over here.
Okay.
And I see no one interested online, so.
Okay, let's move to the next comment. So this comment deals with language that we actually tweaked multiple times because it's kind of unwieldy and we were trying to make it easier to read and easier to understand. Friends suggested that we revert to an earlier version and add some additional language they feel would be helpful in making it clear what the department has to do and what the applicant has to do, specifically that in order for more information to be required, that the department has to request it, and that the applicant, in order to respond to it, has to provide documents responsive to that. So staff doesn't really have strong feelings about this one and is fine with adopting the proposed language if Friends believes it will add value. So we are fine leaving it up to council to decide whether or not you feel this has value as well. But you can see here, this on the slide here, this is what we would modify the language to look like. And there's two places at 15-190 sub 7 and 15-310 sub 11 that are both kind of similar. And if council's okay with adopting this change and adding this additional language, we would modify both of those rules to match what Friends has suggested.
Do we have any comments? I see Councilmember Condon.
Thank you, Cindy Condon. And I agree with the change in the recommendation of staff.
Thank you. We have some head nods over here, some head nods. So we got thumbs up from everyone else. I think we are good to accept that.
Okay. Next slide, please. So this last comment from Friends relates to requests by Friends they didn't provide any proposed language or anything. They just asked for, as you can see here, rules to ensure that the public and reviewing agencies are provided with timely notice and access to additional information submitted by applicants pursuant to some other rules, which essentially deal with supplemental materials. So after we deem an application complete and then we want more materials, Friends is concerned about notice to reviewing agencies and the public about these additional materials. However, these materials would be included in any, public comment period. We would not just include the initial submissions. We would include any supplemental documents that were received. So it's potentially, it's possible that we could update the rules along the lines of what they're suggesting, but we didn't spend a whole lot of time analyzing this because to do so would be outside the scope of this rulemaking. It would involve substantive changes to the process of the application. And so we didn't really evaluate whether this was merited beyond assessing that it is outside the scope, and so not really appropriate to discuss. But if council agrees that this rulemaking suggestion is outside the scope, staff will still make a note of it as a possibility for future rulemakings.
I think we are shaking our heads. Councilmember Condon,
Yes, thank you. I
Yes.
do have a question on this one. If staff asks for additional information from an applicant and it comes in and the department determines the application complete, isn't that in itself notice that the additional information has been received and reviewed?
So these rules specifically deal with requests for information after an application is determined to be complete. So the rules specifically allow for the department to say, to make a recommendation finding the application to be complete, and then upon further review, making a determination that actually we need more, upon further review, we need more information from you. So I think Friends is concerned about making sure that relevant parties gain access to that additional information. But if typically what would happen is that the public doesn't get access to this information until there's a public comment period, which would be after that point anyway. So you're right. You are right that like our existing process already essentially provides that information to the public. We would include any addendums or any supplemental things, even if it took place after finding completeness, upon starting the public comment period. So, there's no hiding the ball. People would have access to these materials in time to be able to comment on them.
And so what I'm hearing is that the process currently allows for that, the information to get to the public. But I would say, and it sounds like we're doing it already, is always being cognizant that the public does have access to additional information as it becomes available.
Yeah, and so the question is, does our current process cover every situation where we receive additional information? I don't want to speak too much on this because we didn't dig too deep on this. Our cursory analysis is that this isn't really an area of large concern, and that additional materials that are submitted do get placed in front of the public in time for public comment. But, I don't want to say categorically that this isn't something that we were concerned about, just that to the extent that it is, it's the scope of a future rulemaking.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. I don't want to belabor it, but I do want to say for the public that's interested that they have their own full-time jobs and other lives, and they may not be checking in regularly. It's that piece that I think might get lost is, when do they check for that additional information? How do they find out?
Okay.
So that's it.
Councilmember Condon, Secretary Cornett's going to respond.
Oh, great. Thanks.
Yeah, I can, and maybe respond more to the mechanics of this. So, if we determine an application is complete and then later on we decide, hey, we actually need more information, that's usually because, after it's deemed complete, we're still working on the draft proposed order. Once we're actually getting into the findings of fact and looking at that more detailed, maybe we decide, okay, we didn't realize some information was missing. So then we would say, you need to provide this information. Mechanically, what would happen then is once we would rely upon that information to, issue the draft proposed order. And then we would combine that. That would actually become part of the complete application. So the information on the website, it would be, whether it's an attachment or addenda, to the specific, portion of the application. And we would clearly point that out to make sure that that information. So, as Tom talked about, when people are commenting on the draft proposed order, and if they want to go back to the application materials, to help determine, did we do it correctly? There would be that sort of mechanical connection with those exhibits associated with, that particular standard. And that would be added to that in some way that it would be very clear. So we've done that in the past, and it hasn't been an issue, and the lack of clarity hasn't been there. At least it hasn't been expressed to us that it's been unclear.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Tom.
Any other comments or thoughts about this comment by Friend of the Gorge or staff's recommendation? No? Okay. So now let's move to staff. Has a couple of proposed additions to the version that was submitted as part of the notice of proposed rulemaking. So I think you went 2 slides, so go back 1. There we go. Okay, so we were discussing earlier about the new notice requirement. So upon a review, we noticed that we missed one. So essentially at 3:45:15 2:20 is one of the many places that there's notice requirements. We failed to add the land management agency or organization with jurisdiction over the protected areas identified in the application, as we did to all the various other places. So we just added this one as well to be consistent. And so staff is proposing that addition. Any questions about that? Okay, the second change that staff is recommending, this one, it's a lot of text on this slide, but in short, we moved some text from 20 to 15 as part of our effort to move language directed at the department to 15. However, kind of is moving a big chunk over. We pulled a little section, a little sliver over that was actually directed at the applicant. And so we kind of reworded it in a kind of a word salad to try to make that directed at the department so that we were being kind of logically consistent. But upon further review, we decided, and what we're recommending here is that we just delete that altogether because it's redundant. It's not really needed. And then we don't have to worry about trying to contort it to fit the department must, theme of Division 15. So staff is recommending just not deleting that, which was in the NOPR version, but was originally not there to begin with, and then modifying language which achieves the same function that's still in 20 and is directed at the applicant, which currently says the applicant must prepare and submit additional copies of the amended NOI as required by 20 Rule 40. To the applicant must provide a printed copy of all or part of the amended NOI to any person on the distribution list as directed by the department. So, regardless, we had to make a tweak here because Rule 40 in the proposed rules is gone. So we had to, that's kind of when we caught this. We're like, wait, this language we got to update the reference because that 40 is gone. But also, why don't we just tweak this to, which is directed at the applicant and in Division 20, so that we don't need that other language in Division 15 at all. So a little bit confusing there, but are there any questions about the recommended change here?
And no question.
Okay.
Councilmember Condon?
Thank you. Sorry. The distribution list, what is the distribution list referred to here?
Yeah, so the distribution list, and actually we did tweak some other rules as well to update how we refer to it, is a list that is essentially the list of people who receive the printed, a copy of the application, which would include like the reviewing agencies. So all the people who we then ask for feedback about the application. So if somebody on that list who signed up to receive a copy wants a printed copy, then the rules say you have to give them a printed copy to review at a reasonable cost. So there's rules in that directed at the applicant that said they have to do that. And then there was rules directed at the department that said that they have to be involved in that. And so we kind of cleaned that up by just saying here that the applicant has to do it as directed by the department, as directed by the department. But yes, the distribution list is everybody who needs to receive the copy of the documents. Essentially, it's similar to the list of people who received notice.
Well, okay, and it's just the definition of that. Where is the definition? So-
Oh, I think what it said before, the rules said that the applicant and the department have to work together to develop a distribution list. And as we discussed at a previous council meeting, we've modified that language to say the department shall, I don't want to butcher it here, but essentially distribute the materials to everybody on the distribution list. So it doesn't define it. And the reason why we didn't is because it's a kind of a static thing. The reviewing agencies, it doesn't change. So I guess it's not in the definitions. It's just the people who need to receive it to be able to make comment on it.
Okay, thank you.
Did you want to say something?
Secretary Cornett.
For the record, Todd Cornett. So there's no direct, I think there's indirect connections here. Basically, we're talking about reviewing agencies, state agencies, local governments, tribal governments, and so, those are static in terms of who those go to. There can be some differences though, in terms of who at what agency and, which tribal governments and which local governments. So, that distribution list, that's why we have to kind of figure that out every time. It's not the same, there can be some different agencies and certainly there can be some different people. So that's why we kind of have to work through to figure out for each project, who are those reviewing agency contacts? Who are those reviewing agencies? And then this basically relates to that. So
Okay.
it's the distribution list for the reviewing agencies. But there is no definition of a distribution list. It goes back to the reviewing agencies, which does have a definition.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Secretary Cornett. Are there any other questions about that suggestion? So that brings us to the council options. And as you can see here, as usual, we have three options, which is to approve the proposed rules as presented with the staff recommendations. Option 2 would be to approve the proposed rules with changes, and then option 3 would be to take no action at this time.
Thank you. Oh, let's get Secretary Cornett.
Madam Chair, if, because there was discussed earlier changes, I think council is probably looking at option 2. And I do have proposed motion language, which you don't have to reflect the conversation that was occurring, if anybody would like that.
Thank you. Councilmember Devlin.
Chair, I just want. One, I think the.
Councilmember Devlin.
I almost have to swallow this microphone. I think sometimes when you make an effort like this to go back and look at inconsistencies in rules or to look at ambiguity, people think that you're not really producing a product. In my mind, though, it's very worthwhile because as things are put together over years, sometimes internal inconsistencies develop, sometimes ambiguities develop. Many times staff and perhaps the council may be aware of those. And obviously your advisory committee on rules probably brought some of those forward. I'm fine with the comments or the recommendations of staff in this area. If there were any comments to the effect that anything we were doing made this less consistent, or there was more ambiguity, or that we had actually changed one of the processes, which would be beyond the scope, then I would be concerned. But I think this effort has been worthwhile, and I think doing this on a periodic basis is something we should regularly do. I mean, even perhaps on 5-year or 10-year basis, at least.
Comments? Anyone else have any comments? No one else has any comments. Is anyone ready to make a recommendation on an option?
Madam Chair, if you don't need the language, I move that we approve the proposed rules with the changes that were indicated and discussed in this meeting by the council and presented by staff.
Thank
That
you.
close enough to?
I would just clarify comment number 3, changes proposed by Friends of the Gorge, and then all of the staff recommendations.
Okay, with that clarification.
Thank you, sir. So we have a motion.
Madam Chair,
Dwyer?
I will second that motion. Oh,
We have a motion and a second. Any further conversation? Hearing none, Mr. Secretary, please call the roll.
Perry Chalktoot,
Yes. Yes.
Ann Byer,
yes.
Cindy Condon,
Yes.
Richard Devlin, Marcy Grail,
Yes.
Kent Howe,
Yes.
Jordan Truitt.
Yes.
Motion carries, Madam Chair.
You, everyone. Tom, well done. We appreciate the way that you present it and your efforts to lead us through this. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Agenda item is the public comment period. This is agenda item C. This time is reserved for the public to address the council regarding any item within council jurisdiction that is not otherwise closed for comment, including the Boardman to Hemingway Amendment 1 draft proposed order. I'm going to defer over to Nancy and Wally. Mr. Secretary is going to say something.
Yeah, just to make sure that everybody's sort of tracking, we're not quite yet at the Obsidian Solar Center draft proposed order public hearing. This is just our regular public comment timeframe. So once that concludes, we'll get into that just to make sure that, people don't feel like this is the time to comment on the Obsidian Solar Center. We're not quite there yet, but we will be soon.
Thank you for that clarification. So I'm going to defer and ask for Nancy and Wally's getting microphones set up. But if anyone has, in the public has wishes to speak on anything not otherwise prohibited, we have comment cards that need to go to Sarah Esterson. And then for those on the WebEx or phone, Nancy will remind you what that is. Thank you. We have no one on the phone. And so again, I'll ask if anyone in the public wishes to speak on anything that's not closed for comment, including the Boardman, the Hemingway Amendment 1 draft proposed order. To our knowledge, we have no one who has presented any comment cards. So we're going to take a last call just to make sure no one is left out. Okay, we are going to close the public comment period at 6:14. I'm just going to ask council members. So if we may, let's take a 5-minute break before we move to our next agenda item. If everyone is okay with that, those joining remotely, we will take 5, please. And we are ready to resume our meeting. The next agenda item is for the Obsidian Solar Center Amendment Number 1, and this will include an information portion provided by Senior Siting Analyst Kathleen Sloan, who will provide a brief overview of the agenda item and the amendment request, and a public hearing in which I will serve as the presiding officer. Ms. Sloan, please proceed with the information portion of the agenda item.
Thank you, Chair Grail. Good evening, council and members of the public who have come to our meeting. Thank you very much for being here. So next slide, Nancy. So we're here to talk about the request for Amendment 1 for the Obsidian Solar Center site certificate. I'm going to go through the next few slides just to give a background on the amendment request and our process and the public participation piece in particular. And then we will switch back over to Chair Grail, who is the presiding officer for the hearing. And during the hearing, that's when we're going to take public comment, public testimony. If anybody here in the room wants to make a public comment, there are yellow comment cards over there on the table. We ask that you fill one out so that we know how to contact you and add you to our list and have your name. And you can also put them in writing. So next slide. Is it frozen? Oh, no.
While we're waiting for that, for the record, Todd Cornett, I'll fill a little bit of time. So we do have the computer up and running in the back of the room. So it has a map on it. So if anybody has any questions about the location of the application or the approved facility or the amendment, we have a map that we can zoom around, zoom in. The certificate holder also brought a map. So on the other table. So if anybody's interested in looking at those details, you certainly can.
Thank you.
Cornett?
Can we go back one more slide? Yes. Okay, so this slide, I just really wanted to give you a quick overview of the meeting for this agenda item. So as I said, I'm going to provide a brief overview. It will go back to Chair Grail for the public hearing overview and then open up for the public hearing piece. Members of the public will be provided the opportunity to comment on the draft proposed order or the request for Amendment 1 or both. Council will also have the opportunity to make comments about any concerns they have. And the certificate holder, who is also here in the room, we have representatives from Obsidian Renewable, will also be provided opportunity to respond to comments or provide additional comment of their own. Next slide. So just very briefly, I just want to give the public piece of the Energy Facility Council, or what we call FSEC review process. It's a consolidated review. We have a 7-member body of the FSEC Council. They're governor appointed, Senate confirmed. They represent diverse array of geographies and backgrounds, and they are the decision-making body for a site certificate. So members of council, this is part of a council meeting, and some of our members are here with us in person and other ones are on the phone. While citing division staff, which is me, I work for the Oregon Department of Energy, we make recommendations to our council, but council is the decision-making body, and I think that's the important thing to emphasize. Next slide. So this graphic shows our citing process for an amendment request. The certificate holder filed a preliminary request for amendment and we issued a public notice, and those things happened back in April. And those things were posted on the internet, on the project webpage. And that's the preliminary request for amendment. It's the certificate holders basically documentation that they submit to us saying we would like to come in for an amendment. This is what we're asking for. And then it's up to us as the department to review that information, determine whether or not it's complete, what type of review process it needs to follow. We go through completeness, and then we will basically determine a request for amendment complete, and a complete RFA will be filed. So we are in a type A amendment process, and the one key distinction in that is that there is a public hearing requirement, and that's why we're here in your community today to have that public hearing as part of the amendment. So after request for additional information and review of the original preliminary amendment request, we determined that to be complete and requested that the applicant submit a complete RFA, request for amendment. This is their first amendment request on the site certificate at the end on July 28th, and they completed all their documentation, resubmitted it to us, and we deemed it complete. We also issued the draft proposed order which is the next step as we take all the application after complete and the department puts it through our review process and we issue a draft proposed order. And that is also noticed. We had a public notice that went out. It was mailed to adjacent landowners and property owners and posted on our website and sent out through our electronic noticing system. And we prepared this draft proposed order, and that is what we are here today on, is having the public hearing on both the complete request for amendment and the draft proposed order that the department prepared. So that public comment period opened on August 1st, and it will close at the end of this meeting tonight. And you have opportunities as members of the public to submit comments through various venues. Can be through the internet, can be through email. It's all in the public notice. You can do it in a comment card today. You can write it down on a piece of paper and hand it to me before the end of this meeting. You can also just make it as an oral statement when we get to the oral testimony piece, and it all becomes part of that process. We then we take all that information and we take what comes out of the public comment period, the hearing tonight, comments that we get from council, and we prepare, as Todd had explained, a draft of a proposed order. And again, that's the department's document, and then we will bring it back to council for review. And when we issue the proposed order, we also issue a notice of an opportunity to participate in a contested case. And it's built into our process, but one thing that I want to stress is that only the persons that have raised a relevant issue in the comment period, the public comment period on this draft proposed order, can participate in a contested case. So if you feel that it's important that those comments get made, they get made within this comment period, they're put on the record, and that they relate to our standards, because we are a standards-based review process. That is the scope of our review. Once all of those things happen at the end, the very last step is the final order in the decision on a site certificate. And that decision is entirely in the hands of council. Council determines whether they will approve the site certificate and whether they will adopt the final order. They might want more changes. So there's a process in which it's fairly iterative, and the intent is that it builds in the public participation and the input that we get from reviewing agencies and the public as we proceed in our review. Next slide. So I'm going to jump into the facility as approved and also the amendment. The site certificate was approved by council on February 25th of 2022. So this is an approved but not yet constructed facility. The certificate holder is Obsidian Solar Center, LLC, which is a subsidiary of a parent company known as Obsidian Renewables, LLC. As approved, it's a 400 megawatt capacity solar facility with related and supporting facilities, including transmission line and a 50 megawatt battery storage in a site boundary that was approved to be 3,921 acres, located about 8 miles northwest of here. And it is within Lake County. And again, this is the first amendment request. So I know that map is not all that easy to see, but to the right of that slide in the orange is the solar array. Then there's an orange line that goes to the left, and that would be the transmission line. As approved, there's a little wedge, and that little wedge is the point of interconnection as approved to attach to an existing PGE transmission line. Next slide. So just a little bit of the procedural history. I went over a little bit. We did get the preliminary request in April. We had additional requests for information that we issued in May. We got all of that information back from the certificate holder and we deemed that the PRFA complete. So we call it a complete request for amendment on July 31st. That's when we received that complete request. And then we issued the department's draft proposed order on August 1st, along with that notice of the public hearing. And all of those materials were made available on our webpage and, for review. And then tonight, we're here to do the public hearing. Next slide. And all the other steps are TBD based on what happens tonight. So in short, the request for amendment 1 is requesting council's approval to make a series of changes. And the way I would frame it is, as I explained in the one map, there's that wedge that would allow them to run the transmission line and connect to the PGE line. This request is basically to add additional area and components and little reconfiguration of the transmission piece and the collection line to allow for the option to tie into the parallel transmission line, which is BPA. And they would have to go at it from a slightly different direction because they can't go underneath. And there's some upgrades that need to be made, changes in the voltage and the configuration to allow them to tie into the BPA line. And the way that it has been proposed by the certificate holder is that their intent is to do one or the other, not both, but it gives them some optionality on how to connect and which line they would connect to, depending on, their power purchase agreement. So there's a few things. They're going to add and expand the site boundary to add this additional 169 acres. I'll show you on the next slide. They're going to construct one of the approved generation step-up substations in that location. And this is if they pick this location for the intertie. They will increase the length and the voltage from 115 to 138 kilovolts. And that again is the upgrade required to intertie to a BPA line as opposed to a PGE line. Similarly, the increase of voltage for the collection system is so to integrate into that 138 kV. And there's a minor, some change in the structure type and height. I think it's a 10-foot change in the height for the above ground transmission. And it's already approved for a combination of above ground and below collector system. So, okay, next slide. So this slide, hopefully you can see on the map, there's the approved facility, which is in the black. The orange square that's off to the crosshatch, and there's a better map behind us on the wall, is the area that they're asking to add to the site boundary. That's that area E, that's the 169 acres. About half of that is in kind of pink. That is their proposed actual micrositing area where the actual components would be sited. At this time, while the proposed amendment is requesting no more than 12 acres of disturbance within that area, it's not entirely determined at this point where exactly that would be sited within that pink micrositing area, which is why that 84 acres is within this requested amended micrositing area. But no more than 12 acres of that area will be disturbed. And the footprint of the GSU stub station, I believe, is supposed to be under 5 acres. And again, it allows for that option of interconnection to the BPA line. Next slide. So just really briefly, this is just a slide to explain the scope of council's review, because this is a request for amendment to ask to amend or add new area to the site boundary. That is really the scope of our review, is the requested amendment in the new additional area. It is not the entire project as it was previously approved. So just want to make that clear. And then also, we have to make sure that for any request for an amendment, that the bond or letter of credit that is required is sufficient to like 20, current dollars and with what they're proposing to do, either changes in equipment or other things like inflation. And then as far as the scope of comments, everything in the complete amendment request is open and eligible for comment. So it's not to limit the comments or questions. It's just to realize like the scope of our review has been the actual requested amendment, this addition to an approved facility, not a reapproval of an existing facility. So just want to be clear about that. Next slide. So I'm going to briefly summarize what is in the draft proposed order. As Secretary Cornett explained earlier, this is not council's review of the draft proposed order, but this is really for information purposes for the public and for council, and anybody who's interested that's participating in this meeting, of just what is in this draft proposed order. What did we see? What did we find? What did we change or not change? So this first slide is really to show you that, based upon, we review every standard on an amendment. So based upon our review, this list is the list of standards for which we really did not see a significant change, either in impact or in findings or in a need for an additional or amended condition to the existing site certificate. So again, you can comment on any of these things, but the way that the draft proposed order is written, we did not find anything substantive. We didn't make any substantive changes. So anything that's in the existing site certificate for these standards still remains. It's still the same. And, we didn't have any concerns about how these changes would maybe change council's facts or findings. Next slide, please. So these are the standards that we did actually propose changes in our draft proposed order. And that's either because we've made additional new findings or new findings of fact, or we have recommended amended or new site certificate conditions specific to these standards. And that's what I'm going to go over very briefly next. But I'm going to keep it brief because the important part of this being here for this meeting is the public hearing. So I don't want to get bogged down. So next slide. So one of our standards is the general standard of review. And basically, it's just that because RFA 1 requests a change in the transmission line corridor, and we have included recommendations that we make an amendment to the general standard condition, existing one, condition 9, that allows for that change, because as it's approved, it's for that 115 kilovolts for the PGE line. So this is to allow them to have that optionality and include the 138 kV option. Next slide. So the next one is organizational expertise. And RFA 1 includes increases in the transmission line voltage, as I had mentioned, the length and the extent of above ground components, increases the GSU substation transformer size, collector substation transformer size. So one of the things that, because of these changes and this changes in just the technical capacity to do this type of work for a different type of configuration, one of the recommended new conditions under organizational expertise were these 6, 7, and 8. They're all very similar. One just applies to pre-construction, construction, and operations. It's just broken out into those phases. But it's really to require that the certificate holder be able to demonstrate that with these changes, they have also, they will also ensure that the right qualified technical people are overseeing this work. So it's really just to make sure that as they scale up, that the capacity and the technical expertise of their experts and their contractors really meet that requirement. And so that's why we have recommended that change. Next slide. So in land use, that area E is currently irrigated agriculture. And if you look at this map, you can see there's a pivot circle in it. So there's a water right that's associated with that. And based upon our discussions, particularly with Lake County, that is a special advisory group for our process, their comments were that it was important that there be no net loss of irrigated ag in the county, so that there needed to, they requested and they needed to see, and our process kind of requires that that the certificate holder demonstrate that water right is transferred for a similar purpose, which the county will allow, to another parcel. So it can't be used for, that water right can't be used for some other use. It's got to be irrigated ag. And that's why we have recommended that council impose new condition under land use, which is condition 8, which will require the certificate holder to submit evidence that that water right has been transferred for any area of that irrigated ag within that parcel, if council approves that additional parcel. So it's to ensure that there's no net loss of irrigated agriculture. Next slide. So under retirement and financial assurance, I think I had mentioned earlier that part of our scope of council's review is to make sure that this bond or letter of credit requirement, that it's adequate, is sufficient. And so we take the current, quarter 2023 dollars. We look at all the equipment and any changes in that decommissioning estimate. And when we ran the numbers, we came up with a new retirement cost of a little over 38 million. And that is the cost to decommission the facility and after the end of the site certificate. And so that is a different amount than what was previously approved. We have a letter on file that the certificate holder has the ability to likely get that bond or letter of credit for $40 million. And we have just recommended that council amend that existing condition to reflect this different 2023 amount of 38 plus million. 38.1 is our estimate. So that was the change that we made, and that's pretty standard for an amendment request as far as updating the cost of the bond. Next slide. The wildfire prevention and risk mitigation standard was adopted after, it's a fairly new standard for council, after the site certificate was issued. So the existing site certificate and the final order on that site certificate, or the original application, did not include information that was developed specific to meet this standard. It did include an actual fire emergency plan under our public services site certificate conditions. So the changes in here were kind of twofold. One was to replace the existing language in the public services that would have in the past been what we looked at for wildfire, to make it more robust to meet our new wildfire standard requirements. And for that reason, we're recommending that, the public services condition 4 basically be deleted or, removed and replaced under the wildfire specific to this standard. And it also really requires that the certificate holder prepare and submit like a more comprehensive wildfire plan before construction. Next slide. And as I stated, because the request for amendment is also including this potential to change the configuration and the capacity of that transmission line from 115 kV to 138, and the also change from the 34 kV to 138 kV collector lines, if that option is selected for construction, we recommended that the transmission, the existing site certificate or under this standard, we have a condition 1, and it's basically updated again to reflect this, to add this optionality, include the 138 kV. And so in our conclusions and recommendations in the draft proposed order, the department is recommending that council find that based upon the preponderance of evidence on the record and with recommended new and amended along with the existing site certificate conditions, that the facility with the requested changes under request for amendment 1 would still continue to comply with the general standard of review and the requirements of a site certificate. So next slide. So this is just kind of to prep you for the hearing part, but I did want to explain that, you know, the public participation process is important to us. And I just want to go a little bit more into the public participation at the DPO phase. So realize that when we issue the DPO, we issue the notice, and that initiates the public comment period. And it's open until the end of this hearing, this meeting tonight. And that the public has the opportunity during that public comment period to submit their comments by mail, by fax, by email. We have a public comment portal that's available on our website, or you can participate by providing oral comment tonight, or write it on a comment card and hand it to me before the meeting ends. All of those are available and opportunities to bring up any comments. I think the one thing, and you'll probably hear this more than once, but anyone who wants to participate in our process beyond this point, as in after this meeting, you need to, or at this meeting, actually, you need to raise an issue on the record. And that's why I said, either you say it in writing in one of those forms, or you say it orally or here tonight. And you need to do that before the public comment period closes. And failure to raise a relevant issue, either orally at the hearing or in a timely manner submitted in written comment in any of those forms, basically precludes from further participation in our process. So that's one of the reasons why you'll hear it more than once tonight, is it's just really important for us to communicate to the public that this is your opportunity to kind of to jump in. And if you really want to ride this one to the end, this is the time to really to get those comments on the record. And that, next slide, please. Because we are a standards-based process, it's really important that your comments are relevant to our process and our standards. And so the first point is the timing. You know, you need to participate. You need to get those comments in the comment period, because council cannot accept or consider comments after the public comment period closes. And the second part is making sure that the content of your comments are relevant to our process. For consideration in a contested case, the issues must be raised within council's jurisdiction, and they must be raised with sufficient specificity so that council, the department, and the certificate holder understand what the concerns are and how they relate to a specific standard. So you must present facts that support your position on the issue. So next slide. And I believe I'm getting to the end. So This is just a little bit more information on the contested case. So it's important that we put it up here. It's, like I said, this is a type A amendment. There are requirements for a threshold for a contested case under a council or a type A amendment. So basically, council has to find that the request raises a significant issue of fact or law that is reasonably likely to affect council's determination on whether the facility meets all the requirements. So council must determine whether the preponderance of evidence on the record supports that position or the proportions of the facility within the area that's being added to the site boundary, and that the amendment that it complies with all laws and council standards. And we have resources available. There's a YouTube video. It's in the public notice. We have public notices in the back of the room. It's also available on the website. That gives you more information about our contested case process. And then council has options on requests for a contested case. And so they can either, on an amendment, they can hold a contested case, they can remand the proposed order to the department, or they can deny because they determined that the request did not really apply to the standards. It wasn't properly raised. So those are all things that the public should be aware of. And at this point, I'm going to stop. I'm going to turn it back over to Chair Grail, who's the presiding officer for the hearing. And she is going to run the public hearing, and there will be an opportunity for anybody in the room to make oral comment. Then we're going to go to the phone, get people off the web if they're on there. So thank you, Chair Grail.
Kate, this is the public hearing on the draft proposed order on the request for Amendment 1 of the Obsidian Solar Center site certificate. I, Marcy Grail, FSEC Chair, am serving as the presiding officer for this hearing. Today is August 24th, 2023. The time is now 6:57 p.m. This public hearing is being held at an Energy Facility Siting Council FSEC meeting in person here at the Parks and Recreation Community Hall in Christmas Valley. This hearing is also being held via a WebEx webinar with a call-in option for those who cannot participate in person or via webinar. Today's hearing is being recorded. The presentations, written comments, and oral testimony are part of the decision record for the amendment request for the facility. The purpose of the public hearing is to provide an opportunity for the public, reviewing agencies, council, and the certificate holder, if they wish to do so, to present oral and written testimony on the amendment request and the department's draft proposed order. The 24-day record of the public hearing comment period on the draft proposed order is scheduled to close at the conclusion of the hearing tonight. Next slide, please. Pursuant to OAR 345-027-0367, subsection 5A and B, please note the following. A person who intends to raise any issue that may be the basis for a contested case must raise the issue in person at the hearing or in a written comment submitted to the Department of Energy before the August 24th, 2023 deadline, with sufficient specificity to afford the council, the Department of Energy, and the certificate holder an adequate opportunity to respond, including a statement of facts that support the person's position on the issue. In the Type A review amendment process, issues eligible for a contested case must be determined by FSEC to raise a significant issue of fact or law that is reasonably likely to affect council determination of compliance with an applicable standard. To raise an issue in a contested case proceeding, the issue must be within the council's jurisdiction, raised in writing or in person prior to the close of the record of the public comment period, August 24th, 2023, raised with sufficient specificity to afford the council, the Department of Energy, and the certificate holder an adequate opportunity to respond. To raise an issue with sufficient specificity, a person must present facts that support the person's position on the issue. Next slide, please. This slide presents the order for tonight's hearing and testimony on the record of the DPO. Members of the public will be called on in the order presented here. If attendees at the meeting wish to comment, please complete and submit a commenter's card prior to testifying. If attendees wish to submit written comments at the hearing to staff, they may do so by completing and submitting a comment card prior to the end of the hearing. I will call on each person interested in providing oral testimony, starting with the certificate holder, then members of the public here in person, then on the webinar, then on the phone. Next slide, please. For any individuals wishing to provide oral testimony during tonight's hearing, for the record, please state the following with your testimony: your full name with spelling, name of the organization or group if you are representing one, and a physical or email address. Okay, so we can go to the next slide. I first would ask, is the certificate holder here? Hello. Would you like to provide testimony?
Thank you. Thank you for traveling to Christmas Valley. I acknowledge you guys all traveled a lot to get here, but several people from Lake County also drove at least 2 hours to
So
get
can
here.
can I get you to state your name and
Sure.
who you're with, please?
Yeah, I'm Laurie Hutchinson, Laurie Hutchinson, HUTCHINSON, with Obsidian Renewables. So yeah, I just want to acknowledge, thanks to Lake County participants for coming from far away. The amendment to the site certificate is pretty basic. I've gotten around to many people in the room to discuss it. And while I know the council can only hear comments on this amendment, many of you know that I'm the main liaison to Lake County. So any questions that don't have to do with the amendment, just take those up with me. I'll leave my cards around. And I think that the main thing to address is that we have added some irrigated land, which we know is a sensitive thing to do in Lake County. There's not a lot of private land that is, and there's not a lot of irrigated land here. So we did check with the landowners to make sure that they would be able to move their water rights. They've already put a letter in the record that they're going to move their water rights. And then it's further confirmed with the additional things that you put into the draft proposed order, that there will be ample evidence that the water rights will be moved and there will be no net loss. The other changes are mainly technical. We just to clarify, we probably would have raised the voltage. It's anyway, no matter which site we choose. The change to 138 was just a technical change that that would have been common. It would have been likely to happen on either side. And then the length of the GenTie, I just wanted to explain, we undershot a little bit when we initially put in our application. And then as we were looking at where we actually would put a substation, we decided to move it pretty far north on the parcel that we're micrositing on. So the 89 acres in which we're micrositing, that gets us further away from the closest neighbors, which we thought was a sensitive way to site, and will allow a pretty good buffer from a big new piece of infrastructure. That's about all I have. As I said, I'll leave my cards around. So questions not related to the amendment that aren't appropriate for this hearing can just come to me directly. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there questions from council members?
Chair Grail,
Yes.
for the record, this is Perry.
Yes, Councilmember Chalk-Tooth.
The record, this is Perry Chalk-Tooth, and I want to notify you that I have a conflict. Being a newly seated member of the Klamath Tribal Council, we have entered into an off-project monitoring agreement and an agreement with Obsidian, and therefore I have a conflict in making council or making a statement or decisions.
Thank you for that notice to the council. So I think we'll just won't expect to hear anything from you during this time. I'm going to ask Council Secretary Cornett to address Councilmember Chalk-Tooth.
Yep. Thank you, Councilmember Chalk-Tooth. We remember that you did recuse yourself previously on the Obsidian Solar Center project, so I think that's appropriate. There is no decision making tonight, but there will be at some point in the future, so we will make note of that. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Councilmember Byer.
Thank you, Chair Grail. Just to make sure I'm clear, the proposal is really to give you some options in where you send your GenTie lines. Is that correct?
Yeah, our original application had us interconnecting on the west of the 3 sets of lines that bisect that property. And it's most likely we will interconnect to the east set of lines. So this amendment allows us to interconnect to the east set of lines.
Great, thank you. And thank you also to everybody who showed up tonight. This is really impressive and I've never been here before, so it's pretty exciting. So thank you for welcoming us here. The other thing that I always have to get straight in my mind with amendments is that all the conditions in the original site certificate carry forward to this amendment. So all that's being proposed is additions or major or minor tweaks to those original conditions. And this is kind of a question for Kate, but we're really just adding conditions to reflect this new configuration and the wildfire, which is a big deal. So thank you.
Council Secretary.
Yeah, I just wanted to remind everybody, we had the maps up earlier. If anybody during their testimony, or if, you just brought the question up about some of the physical locations, if anybody wants to make a point, please just let us know. We can go to those slides, and help kind of point out if you have anything specific that you want to comment on, and it would be helpful to have the map up.
Thank you. Thank you. Councilmember Devlin. Good job, Ann. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This is to the Obsidian representative, and council can stop me if my question is outside our purview or if he feels he needs to. In this changing of where the water rights are being used, I would anticipate that the underlying landowner will have some costs associated with that in most cases, because they'll actually be moving infrastructure. There may be also issues relative to the soil types and perhaps the condition of the soils. In this change, is the landowner being compensated for some of those costs?
They're being compensated very well for the land.
Okay.
And I can't speak on behalf of them, and they are not here tonight. I did give them an extra notice that this meeting was happening in case they wanted to speak on behalf of themselves. I could guess it's a 5/8 pivot. They can only go so far because of where the lines are on this particular property. So
Yeah,
I
was
could
just
imagine.
curious. I was just curious about.
Yeah, I could imagine they are a large landowner in the area, and I could imagine they may be able, if they have the water rights, to perhaps get a full pivot.
Now,
I
they could
don't know.
imagine they could offset the costs by the purchase price of the land.
Yeah. Land close to a valuable power line goes at a premium.
Thank you. Okay, if we may go to the next slide, please. And before I open up the public hearing to public testimony, I want to remind the public that prior to the close of the record, you may submit written testimony in a variety of ways: the comment portal, email, and handing in your written comment tonight. I would also ask the next slide, please. I would like to get a sense of the number of people interested in testifying to determine if we need to set any time limits. Would y'all mind raising your hand if you plan to speak tonight?
I was waiting for 10 or 12 people.
Okay, well, I think with 3, then there probably is no need to focus on any time limits. And I would like to reiterate what Councilmember Byer said. We are pleased to see so many of you in attendance, so we could be here with you today. In addition to that, for those on the WebEx, would you please use the raise your hand feature? And for those on the phone, please push *3. I'm going to see if I can see Nancy back there if we have anyone that is indicating they wish to speak. Nancy's indicating that there is no one wishing to speak, so we're going to continue moving on. There will be no time limit, but I'm certain everyone's going to be mindful and clear to their point of which they wish to address. Mr. Secretary, I will ask, or I guess Kate has them. Are there individuals in the room who've provided a comment card?
Comment cards.
Start turning.
Okay. So I have 3 comment cards that were filled out, but they did not indicate that they wanted to necessarily make a comment. So well, one of them did. Terry Crawford. It's Terry Crawford. Oh, okay. Okay, that's fine. You're not obligated. Okay. Okay, well, thank you. Thank you for that comment. I have a Mr. Garth Finley. You okay, so you don't care to make a comment. And then Alan Parks. Okay. So I guess that's the thing. We want to just make sure that everybody in the room going, like that. If anybody wants to make a comment, this is the time. And if not.
Okay. Well, thank you. I'm going to look back at Nancy one more time. She's still giving me a no back there. We are down with our nonverbal communication here. Well, if we have no one in the room who wishes to speak. We have no one on the WebEx who wishes to speak. We have no one on the phone who wishes to speak. I guess that will, oh, sorry. Okay.
One thing I did want to bring up to the public and council is we did get one comment on this amendment request, and council has been provided with a copy of that comment. It came through our comment portal, and I think in general it was a general comment about solar facilities. It wasn't necessarily specific to this amendment request, was my take on it. And it's available on our citing docket.
Raising that, Kate. Nancy, if you would advance the slide. So we're gonna call that there are no comments on either of our ways to make comments, and we're going to continue. So Nancy, if you will advance the slide to council, thank you. I will look to the council members to see if anyone wishes to make any comments to the department or the certificate holder. I see no comments coming from, thanks for the thumbs up, buddy. Sorry, council member Truitt. Sorry. Well, so I have to ask Secretary Cornett, am I allowed to say anything if I'm presiding? Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, Madam Chair. Yeah, absolutely. You're still a member of the council. While you're the presiding officer, you can have both hats.
Okay.
So.
Thank you. So what I would like to say, first of all, thank you, Kate, for your effort in presenting this. As she went through at the beginning, our standards, and there were a long list that she didn't comment on. One of the things that I would like all of you to know that my peers and I, we've taken our responsibilities extremely seriously. And at a cursory glance, it looks like the places that you dug into are the ones that we have regularly raised. I don't think anyone would be surprised to know that we're all very concerned about wildfire. We are ultra concerned about making sure, professionals are doing the work, and certainly your land, because this is your community. So I just, on behalf of our council, want you all to know that those are the things. We all come from very different backgrounds, and we're working with staff to make sure that we're upholding our responsibilities. And again, by your presence here, it allows us to do our jobs as well. So I just wanted to say thank you to everyone again. Certificate holder, based on the comments and lack thereof, received tonight and on the record. Do you wish to provide any additional comments while the record is still open? Or would you like to remain that the record remain open?
You can close the record.
Thank you very much. So with that, next slide, please. That means the time is now 7:15 p.m. on August 24th, 2023. The public comment period on the draft proposed order for the Obsidian Solar Center request for Amendment 1 is now closed. And with that, I'm going to again look to council members to see if anyone wishes to say anything before we move to adjourn our meeting. All right. Well, the time is now 7:16 p.m. and the August 24th, 2023 meeting of the Energy Facility Siting Council is now adjourned. Thank you.